In today's video, the mighty Mazda CX-60 SUV comes to you in not one, not two, but four, dude. Four different powertrain configurations. There's a 2.5 litre entry-level Atmo 4-cylinder petrol engine, and then there are two turbo 6s, 3.3 litres apiece, a petrol and a diesel, and then there is a 2.5 litre petrol 4 teamed up with a plug-in hybrid EV powertrain. And I have to say, on paper, that plug-in hybrid is looking pretty good. And yet, I would argue it is not the one that would suit most people for their next vehicle here in Australia. And in this video, we're going to drill down into exactly why. This video is inspired by you. If you are a dude named Davo who emailed me yesterday, it's actually a pretty good window, I think, into a new car buyer psychology, because there are so many mentally gymnastic, fantastic hoops that people just jump through when they put themselves in the market for a new car. It's really interesting. Mazda's take on new energy vehicles too, it's a really good window into that, because not too many car makers have been brave enough to put their cojones on the line and open their checkbook and pay the big R&D bucks to develop a brand new inline 6-cylinder diesel engine. And the way I see it, the car industry is split into these two very disparate camps. There's camp new energy, we're all in on electrification, and then there's camp, nah, combustion's going to be here for a while. We still need to invest in that. Toyota, Mazda, etc. over here, Hyundai, Kia, etc. over here, okay? And ultimately, only one of these camps is going to be on the winning team. However, the midterm future plays out, but I wouldn't be betting against Team Toyota/Mazda at this stage, at least. But it will be interesting to see. And this new diesel engine of Mazda's, I'd have to say, it's pretty good. It's very compelling, despite all the rhetoric that we hear from time to time about electrification and how tantalizingly close it really is. Mazda has certainly been that brave to do that in the way that not many car makers have. So let us talk about all of that and Davo's specific thought processes and, all the roadblocks on the way to owning a new car, therefore. And I'll get you down to the bottom of the list about which Mazda CX-60 I would buy. This report is sponsored by NordVPN. Get a mega discount plus 4 extra months for free right now with my exclusive deal. Go to nordvpn.com/AEJC now. Online security threats are everywhere, but you don't have to be the next victim. That's where NordVPN comes in, locking everything down securely in the background. Go to nordvpn.com/AEJC now. Every 2-year plan receives that huge discount plus 4 extra months of Nord for free. nordvpn.com/AEJC. Using NordVPN is easy. Just subscribe, download the app and connect. One click later, your IP address is shielded and your traffic is encrypted across as many as 6 of your devices. Nord is the fastest VPN on the planet. It costs only about as much as a single cup of coffee every month to keep your data, your identity, and your devices secure. Masking your location means you'll be able to access content and resources that might be blocked where you live. Plus, you can continue to watch your favourite content when you travel. Boost your online security at nordvpn.com/AEJC. Get that mega discount and enjoy those 4 extra months for free. It's all totally risk-free with Nord's rock-solid 30-day money-back guarantee. It's easy to stay safe online. Go to nordvpn.com/AEJC now. It must be said, the old Davo played a pretty smart game here. He lulled me into a false sense of complacency with his initial email, which went, Oh, quite a few years ago now, I sent you an email about a new car. We ended up buying a Mazda CX-9 through you guys. No problems whatsoever. 3 words. Well, I'm now trying to nag the wifey into a new car. I figure 7 or 8 years is enough for various reasons. Just wondering if I fire off some more questions, could John help me narrow my decision down even further? Thank you, Davo. Okay, so I said I was happy to help. You know, it might surprise you, but I'm actually quite diplomatic at times. I said, happy to help, mate. Just reply to this email with those questions and I'll do what I can. So he sent me that. Thanks a lot. Dude, I'm not going to read all of that to you because only one of us had to suffer through that, or 2 if you include Davo, but anywho, I'm not going to do that to you. I'm just going to say that on Davo's shortlist were the following vehicles, and this is one of the burdens, right? If you're in the market for a new car, one of the biggest burdens is the burden of choice, because there's no shortage of that in the market, and it's getting worse with the rise of all of these unknown Chinese manufacturers because they're adding to the complexity of any decision. There's more options on the table now than at any other time, frankly. Anyway, Davo's shortlist was a Volkswagen Tiguan. Now, it may be that Davo has not been watching the show for quite as long as he might have, but 7 or 8 years ago he did reach out and I helped him with a new car then. So that's long enough to know my view on Volkswagen. I mean, Volkswagens are beautiful cars. They're gorgeous and they're lovely to drive too. They've generally got really good refinement and dynamics, but the reliability is typically crap. The customer support is not quite as bad as Stellantis, but close. And the company's moral compass is broken, right? You can't just decide to poison the world because that makes sense for the bottom line. We had other obligations to our stakeholders kind of thing, and engage in a global fucking criminal conspiracy, as well as just for kicks before Christmas or whatever it was, throwing a few monkeys in a gas chamber just for fun. I mean, that's the kind of organisation you're proposing to get in bed with if you want to buy a Volkswagen. So I'd suggest don't do that if you know what's good for you. Come on. The thing that gobsmacks me about Volkswagen owners when their car shits itself and they get basically just thrown under the bus by the dealer and Volkswagen is that they expected something different. Like, the evidence is there in the public domain, dude, and yet you expect something different. That's the crazy part about Volkswagen owners. And some Volkswagen owners don't experience any problems. They're on their 12th Volkswagen and they are flat out Volkswagen fanboys. I get that. And if that's you, well, you really have cheated death, dude. The other option was a Lexus NX350H, which I'd say Lexus is really good quality, excellent value, like backed by Toyota, so not really that much can go wrong, except they're just as boring as batshit. And if that appeals, then great. Lexus and you would be very happy together, I'm sure. Davo also said he was potentially interested in an Hyundai Tucson, and perhaps there was an N version of Tucson coming soon. I'm not sure about the N version of Tucson. I know there was an N, Kona N, which is like might as well have come out of a lab in Wuhan, as far as I'm concerned. It was a bit of a twisted freak, like it had to be put together in CRISPR. Tucson and N. It was an amazing car. I drove it once on a racetrack and awesome, but just also weird. And why would you buy one as opposed to an i30N? I thought to myself at the time. So there was that. Not sure about a Tucson N, maybe. I mean, anything's possible, but I wouldn't be holding my breath for that in any case. CX60 was on Davo's list, as well as BMW X3. And I get the X3 thing as well, dude, because you get to a time in your life, I suppose, and you say, well, we've had the big family bus, the CX-9, and it's done us really well, and now we want something a bit premium. I would suggest on the German premium car issue, right? If you're not spending north of 150 grand, I'm not sure that a premium German car is a particularly inspiring / good idea. Like, they know how to charge you through the neck for owning the badge, but if you're not spending 150 grand or more, I'm not sure you're getting enough car to justify the inconvenience of owning the badge, or the bend over, grab your ankles, it's time to service the car again cost of owning the badge kind of thing. So one prerequisite from Davo, he says, whatever vehicle I buy, it has to fit a set of golf clubs. So Davo is one of those who wants to ruin an otherwise perfectly serviceable walk using geometry. Like, come on, dude. In a special park, a park that's been specifically reserved for other serial masturbators who enjoy that. Men who get together because they enjoy a good stroke, kind of thing. Is it any wonder that intelligent extraterrestrial life stays away? Honestly, golf. Come on. Anyway, Davo concludes with a quote, "I do not think I want an EV yet." No, Davo, you don't. Most people don't. Like, EV sales are only sort of 7 and a bit % of the market. This is despite massive incentivization. People just don't want them. You know, most people don't want them. The median new car buyer in Australia doesn't want one. All the early adopters who wanted, it's them versus big oil kind of thing, they've all got their EVs now, right? They were prepared to pay through the neck. 20 grand extra to shove it up big oil's clacker kind of thing. Yeah, no problem. However, the problem here is that for ordinary motorists who really couldn't give a shit about that and just want the right new car for them, it's a much harder sell to say, hey, here's this shiny new electric car. It's only going to cost you $20,000 more than an equivalent petrol car. How about that? Most people get, show me the petrol car. Dude. Davo, I do not think I want an EV yet. I just don't think the infrastructure is adequate. If I'm driving to Melbourne, we live in Sydney, or to visit family, 6 to 7 hours drive north, I don't want to have to wait long to get onto a charger and then wait half an hour for it to charge. Yeah, that's if the charger's operational, and uptime for chargers is pretty shit also. Davo says, I did hear that the new BMW i3 has about 700 or 800 Ks of range. That might get me into an EV. I'd suggest that EVs as ownership propositions are a bit of a dud, except if you have a very particular usage case in mind, which does not involve Sydney to Melbourne all that often, or driving north for 6 to 7 hours to see these people or those people, you know. The depreciation is going to be horrendous also, because the buyer of your car at the end of your ownership, if it's an EV, he's got no way of determining whether or not the battery's about to shit itself, because the average battery in a Tesla, for example, has like 7,000 cells. That means 7,000 modes of failure with no warning. And there's a welded connection, like a spot welded connection at each end of those cells. So that's 14,000 welded connections. Okay, so there's 21,000 potential modes of failure with absolutely no warning. And if it does shit itself in this way, the price of a replacement battery is going to be more than the vehicle is worth. So that is a real roll of the dice / game of Russian roulette. And if that happens to you, the hammer just came down on a loaded chamber and you're screwed, dude. So there's that. Ultimately, we got Davo down to the CX60 as being the most rational choice. Oh, the other thing I'd say about the maybe Tucson N is that a performance car sometimes seems like a really attractive option. And if you're a performance nut, if you love changing gear and tipping the car in at the limit and you love all that shit all day long, then you already get that. You know what it's like to own a performance car, right? But if you just have this nebulous concept about owning an N car because of the badge and because it's a performance car, but you don't have any sort of hands-on experience with a performance car. There's a lot of shitful things about owning a performance car if you're not a performance nut, and it's probably not a really good fit unless you are a full-on performance nutcase. I'd say that, okay? But anyway, got him away from that, and we're on to the CX60 at this point. And I thought my work here is done, and Davo gets back to me after writing me War and Peace on this and that. One final question, if that's okay. Petrol or diesel for the CX60? Thanks again, Davo. All right, so let's talk about that. And that's really the meat and potatoes, I guess, of this report. But part of it is I want to go down this track of buyer psychology and like what do people think of when they want to buy a new vehicle, and what forks in the road do they take, and how could that possibly help you? Because ultimately you've got to get from a whole market of complexity down to a segment that you want to own a car in, like a medium-sized SUV or something. And then you've got to get down to the one that you want, because until you get to the one that you want, you can't make any progress, really, can you? Or everything you've done is just kind of, hair and makeup, whereas this is the money shot. Which one do you want? Okay, so if it's the CX60, he's talking about petrol or diesel, but I want to talk about, and he only wants the Azami, right? Because golf club, blah, blah, blah. The range-topping Azami. So having the Azami takes the 2.5-litre 4-cylinder petrol engine, like the entry-level engine, off the table, because Azami is not available with that. And it's only in the lower grades to cut the price, okay? So that kind of tells you what the 2.5-litre engine is. It's just there to be a cheap, serviceable, okay engine that doesn't set the world on fire, but we wouldn't dream of putting it in the top of the range kind of thing. So that engine, the 2.5-litre, is in the Pure, the Evolve and the Touring variants of CX60. The Azami only has the other three. That's the 2.5-litre PHEV, the plug-in hybrid, and then 3.3-litre turbo petrol and 3.3-litre turbo diesel. So let us break that down for performance and price. Starting with the turbo petrol, the 3.5-litre inline-six turbo petrol engine. In the Azami trim, it's $68,440 plus on-road costs. So 68.5 plus a few grand to get it on the road. 209 kilowatts at 6,000 RPM. So that's healthy, but it needs a big rev to deliver that. And 450 Newton meters from 2,000 to 3,500 revs. And the reason it's important always to think about peak torque is because that's more of a window into real world performance for that engine, like power equals torque times revs. Okay, so if you know the mid-range torque, the peak torque in the mid-range, that'll give you mid-range power. It's a proxy for mid-range power. Incidentally, you can't just get Newton meters times RPM and multiply them using a calculator and have kilowatts fall out in your lap. It doesn't work that way. You have to convert RPM into radians per second, and you had to pay attention at school to do that. So don't worry about how to do that. I think I've already done a couple of videos on that, but anyway, it doesn't matter. But you need to look at the revs and the number for the peak torque, and it tells you a lot about how that engine is going to perform in the real world. And this isn't too bad, like 450 Newton meters from 2,000 to 3.5, that's the benefit of direct injection and turbocharging. It gives you nice, beefy, mid-range power production and quite linear response in that range, and slightly on each side of it as well. It'll be nice and linear if you have to mash your foot to the floor to get going one day. All right. You got to remember why power matters too. And power matters because it's the only thing that makes cars accelerate. It's not, people go, oh, I can feel that mid-range torque. You can't, dude. You can't feel that mid-range torque at all. You can feel the mid-range power, right? That power makes cars accelerate. So that's 209 at 6,000, 209 kilowatts at 6,000, 450 Newton meters from 2,000 to 3.5. And then if we go to the 3.3-litre turbo diesel engine, which is also an inline six, so it's sort of directly comparable, it's 187 kilowatts at 3,750 RPM. Not quite as much peak power, okay, like about 20 kilowatts less of peak power, but at substantially lower revs, which means it's more accessible. And the same thing to a lesser extent with the peak torque, which is 550 Newton meters from 1500 revs up to 2400. The interesting thing here is to exploit the peak power in the diesel, you don't have to rev it as high. It's only got to go to slightly less than 2/3 of the revs of peak power with the petrol engine. And if you're already at peak torque, you don't have to climb that much above peak torque to get to peak power, right? So if you're in the peak torque range at about 2000 RPM, you've only got to get to like 3750 in the diesel. But if you're in the middle of the peak torque range at about 2700 RPM, you've got to go all the way to 6000 to get to peak power. And that involves a lot more gear changing and a lot more rotational inertia shunting in the powertrain. And that's why diesels always feel a little bit more effortless to drive, because they just go, yeah, you want a bit more, it's close kind of thing, and they just get there more easily. The difference is, of course, if you go to a drag strip, the petrol engine always wins kind of thing. Or if you're overtaking a truck uphill and you need absolute maximum power and you've revved up to 6,000 or something, then there's no question the turbo petrol is going to accelerate better than the turbo diesel. But for daily driving and loping along on the highway and coping with a steep hill that just presents itself after you've been driving for a couple of hours, the diesel all day long. Let's talk about the plug-in hybrid now, because it's a 4-cylinder petrol engine, 2.5 litres, and you get 241 kilowatts out of it, again at 6,000. And like 6,000 tends to be the magic revs for peak power for all petrol combustion engines, right? It's about that. It's mainly limited there for durability, I think, because hypothetically, the higher you rev an engine, the more power you produce if you can maintain the torque production. But these days, most engines limit themselves to about 6,000 RPM. So anyway, 241 for the plug-in hybrid, kilowatts that is, versus 187 for the diesel and 209 for the petrol. So on paper, the plug-in hybrid is well in front, and 500 Newton meters at an unspecified range of revs with this powertrain. That's in the middle between the turbo petrol on 450 and the turbo diesel on 550. But let's just think about that for a moment, because the petrol engine in the plug-in hybrid can only contribute a maximum of 141 kilowatts out of 241 in total, and 261 Newton meters out of a total of 500 for that powertrain. And that means obviously that the other 100 kilowatts of peak power and the other 239 or whatever it is Newton meters of torque are coming from the electric side of the powertrain. And this means, obviously, that the battery needs to be sufficiently charged to deliver that at that point in time when you demand it. Otherwise, these peaks will not be forthcoming. And this is why, at least it's one of the reasons why, it's such a good idea and so necessary to commit to charging your plug-in hybrid overnight if you own one. There's no point in having a plug-in hybrid unless you're going to be a Jedi of recharging it sort of thing. You're going to just be carrying around a bunch of additional ballast. In relation to the pricing, once again, it's like $68.5 for the turbo petrol. It's $70.5-ish for the turbo diesel, and it's $81,500 for the plug-in hybrid. So that means that the plug-in hybrid is $11,000 more than the diesel, or $13,000 more than the petrol engine in the Azami range. Okay, that's a big step for most people, I'd suggest. The diesel is a pretty new engine too, so it's got all the latest technology and all the widgets that just mean it's up there, you know, like it's the best diesel that Mazda has ever made, at least in my view. So the diesel is the real world winner for most people, and that's because its peak of 187 kilowatts in isolation is not real shabby. You don't have to go back that far. In fact, 1997 would be where you have to go back to. That was the first year that a Holden V8 engine in a Commodore produced more than 187 kilowatts. Prior to that, it was all less. That was the 195i VT Commodore, produced more than 187 kilowatts, but it would have been at like 5.5 or 6,000 RPM. So the CX60 is producing that end of last century level worth of V8 power at a fraction of the revs, which is why it seems freaking effortless, you know. The mid-range power for the diesel is particularly strong, and you could calculate that out. You could go to ChatGPT if you want and get the power figures at, let's say, 2,500 or 2,000 RPM for each one of those engines. But the real difference here would be the power available at 2,000 RPM in the diesel compared with the power available at the same revs in the petrol, because it would be 25% more kind of thing, 22.5, something like that. It's a substantial power increase at the same revs, right? And we don't know with the plug-in hybrid because they don't specify the rev range. The diesel's only $2,000 more than the 3.5 litre turbo petrol. So that's not a big step for most people to justify if they're already spending ballpark $70,000 on a car. If you sat there and they said, hey, we got this slightly better engine, it's going to cost you another $2,000, you go, yeah, okay, great. Why are we even talking about this kind of thing? The turbo petrol, not as strong in the mid-range. The fuel economy is going to suffer if you thrash it in the way that it doesn't so much with the diesel. You can drive diesels really hard, and it doesn't make that much difference to their fuel consumption. But when you start thrashing a petrol engine, like driving it in a spirited way, you really suffer. The economy really suffers. And the other thing about the petrol is you just have to rev its tits off. Like its cha-chas are all over the place to exploit its peak power. And if you enjoy that kind of thing, great. But a medium sort of SUV is not the typical platform for the person who enjoys thrashing the crap out of their car. It's much nicer in a medium sort of SUV to just have a relatively capable diesel engine that's got heaps of outputs without very many revs, just loping along, punting you effortlessly through the scenery. It's a very satisfying experience. Let's talk about the plug-in hybrid now, because the internal combustion engine itself is only capable of 141 kilowatts there and 261 Newton meters, and this presupposes that the electrical side of the plug-in hybrid powertrain is sufficiently healthy to make up the deficit to give you that additional performance. And obviously that can't happen if the battery is somehow depleted, because if you mash your foot to the floor in the plug-in hybrid and the battery is somewhat depleted, then there's no spare capacity of the engine to drive a generator to charge up the battery to make the electrical side work. That would be like a breach of the first law of thermodynamics. You can't have that power twice, is kind of what that says. So in those situations, if the battery gets depleted, you're back to a pretty heavy car with a pretty small combustion engine that's not really tuned for peak performance. So there's that. If you didn't charge it overnight, or you've been driving it a lot and you've allowed the battery to get depleted from driving it, then you pull out to overtake a truck, and it's not going to be as satisfying as the peak performance figures in the specifications suggest. There's going to be plenty of operational scenarios on the highway in particular where that takes place, you know, especially in challenging terrain, driving up mountains and things of that nature. So this is just not the case for the diesel. You can have the peak power and the peak torque out of the diesel whenever you want it. The throttle is a demand switch, or the accelerator is a demand switch, and it's available. You just demand it and the mechanical bits start to spin. They get a bit more turning and burning, and you get that performance that you demanded. Whereas with the plug-in hybrid, at times it's just going to slam the window on you and that performance will not be available. So that's going to be interesting and variable. In the real world, the diesel's going to outperform plug-in hybrid therefore. And I say that in terms of its straight line performance, but also its fuel economy, because the ridiculous fuel economy quoted for plug-in hybrid vehicles in the specifications is predicated on them having a full battery and them running at times, plenty of the time for the official tests, in EV mode. And if you've been driving like for 2 hours up the road, your battery might not be in that kind of state of health at all. And if the battery is depleted and you're on combustion only, running on combustion only, then you're going to be looking at more like 8 litres per 100 or something of that nature, because it's a little engine powering a big, heavy car. And in any case, the peak power performance of the plug-in hybrid versus the diesel is not as great as the numbers suggest, because the plug-in hybrid is also about 150 kilos heavier. So that's roughly the same as having 1.5 or 2 passengers, depending on how often they eat at Macca's, kind of thing. Now, I guess we should talk about the justifications people use for buying a plug-in hybrid, because there are plenty of plug-in hybrid options available these days, and you got to sit down and you got to say to yourself, well, why am I buying that plug-in hybrid? Why does that matter to me? How am I going to justify it? And the first one might be performance, because quite often the plug-in hybrid is the performance leader in particular ranges of vehicles. That's certainly the case, for example, with the GWM Cannon Ute. The plug-in hybrid shits it in. It is clearly a rip snorter in terms of the performance compared with just the diesel one or something, you know. But the plug-in hybrid in the CX60 is really only in front on peak power. The diesel is in front on peak torque. So in the mid-rev range, the diesel is going to feel better. It just is. And that means you can really only even say that about the plug-in hybrid, about it being in front on peak performance, if you can be asked plugging it in regularly. Like if you get home every day and you plug it in and you kick off every morning tomorrow with a fully charged battery, then you are going to be in front on peak power. But there have been plenty of experiments run, in particular with fleets overseas, where the business thought it was a grand idea to buy plug-in hybrids and give them to all of these workers to do their jobs with. They take them home and they can't be asked, or they're fundamentally disinclined to plug the vehicle in because it's like taking a work obligation home with you or something, and they just can't be asked doing it. And therefore, the whole plug-in hybrid system essentially just becomes excess baggage. So if you really can't, routinely commit to plugging in, then that's just going to be a waste of your resources, buying a plug-in hybrid. If you can do it and you want to do it and you want to prove to yourself you can do it, then great. Another justification is probably saving fuel, although I'd suggest that if you've got $80,000 to spend on a CX60 plug-in hybrid, you're probably not saving fuel because you want to save money. And it's an absurd proposition anyway, right? Like spend $11,000 to $13,000 more to start saving money on fuel is ridiculous, right? Especially when you consider the payback period, which we'll get to in just a second. So if you want to save fuel, you're probably just doing that in the context of reducing emissions, because there's a strict stoichiometric proportionality between the amount of fuel you drink and the amount of CO2 you emit if you're a car. Okay, so if you want to save fuel to reduce emissions, that's a pretty expensive way of doing it, spending $11,000 to $13,000 more. And now, so if we have some sort of world event there where there's a crisis in the Middle East or God knows what, and fuel goes back up to $2 a litre kind of thing, then you need to save 6,500 litres of fuel to repay the $13,000, don't you? And I'd suggest that the petrol version of or 5,500 with the petrol. Okay, so the petrol version of this car, the official fuel numbers there are 7.4, and the plug-in hybrid is 2.1 litres per 100 kilometres in both cases. But in reality, you're probably talking about a disparity of more like 3 litres per 100 with petrol versus plug-in hybrid kind of thing. And that means you can do the maths any way you want, but you're talking about 150 to 200,000 kilometres of driving to repay the money or save that amount of fuel, save the CO2, whatever. So that's probably longer than you're going to own the vehicle. So you're never going to be in front if you do that. Should have bought the petrol, or even better, the diesel kind of thing, plus the 150 kilos extra of mass built into that car, which is largely really expensive, toxic stuff, you know, heavy metals and compounds you don't want to come into contact with, like lithium hexafluorophosphate and things of this nature. There's a huge CO2 impost in just exploiting those resources and turning them into the electric side of your plug-in hybrid powertrain. And then there's the environmental cost of disposal. So we have to ensure that these batteries of today in vehicles don't just end up in frickin' landfill somewhere, or don't just end up in a warehouse. Someone rents a warehouse and puts it full of, fills it up with dead batteries and then just scarpers and doesn't pay the rent anymore. And the poor bloody landlord has got, cubic meters upon cubic meters of dead batteries, and they have to be disposed of in some way. This is the dark side of just embracing net zero without doing actual integration of the technology into society, because at least here in Australia, there is absolutely no regulatory mandate to recycle the batteries. There's no legislated chain of custody or responsibility on whose frickin' responsibility is it to make sure that the battery that this punter bought from that dealership back in 2025, like if we look through this from the prism of, 2035 or 2040, the question is, that punter bought that battery from that dealership way back in 2025, whose responsibility is the disposal of the battery, and how can that be done responsibly, and what sanctions will be issued against people for not doing that, right? Then you got to talk about the CO2 just to make those expensive components in the first place. So it's not as if you can just do this net zero thing easily. And in the case of these plug-in hybrids, it's hard to justify that because they're so much more expensive. The diesel and the petrol in the CX60 come with a space saver spare tyre, and that's going to be so useful driving interstate or driving 6 or 7 hours north, because if you have a flat tyre and you've got a space saver, you can at least remain mobile and get to the next part of civilization that might conceivably offer you a full-sized replacement tyre. Whereas the plug-in hybrid comes with the scourge of modern new energy vehicles, which is a tin of frickin' goop to seal up the tyre and a compressor, which is only going to work for a very minor defect in the tyre. And if that doesn't work, if you've got some dirty big thing that's just ripped a hole in the side wall of the tyre and that hole is that long, the tin of goop is not going to help, dude. And that means that your family holiday is sidelined and your pride and joy new energy vehicle is going on a flatbed, and it's got to go Christ knows where, probably to the nearest Mazda dealer where you can pay through the neck for a replacement tyre. And you'll have to wait until Monday morning if that happens at, 6 p.m. on a Friday or something. I know at least 3 people, insiders in the car industry, senior executives, who have driven extensively. Their company cars have been these new energy vehicles, and 3 or 4 of them, I can think of 3 off the top of my head, who have been in exactly that situation or a variation on those themes. And they're totally offside about this deficiency sotto voce, privately, one-on-one, they're like, oh, what a shit idea kind of thing. But publicly, they won't address it at all. And these dudes, and they are all dudes, they got no financial skin in the game. It's just a company car. Like it's part of their contract. It's not like they spent 80 grand of their own money on it. So, imagine how you would feel if you did spend your own money like that. And your family holiday was rooted for, I don't know, 3 or 4 days because of a simple flat tyre, just because they couldn't package the battery anywhere else in the existing platform. So the spare tyre had to go, kind of thing. The other plug-in hybrid issue really is a kind of elephant in the room here, and it is the elephant of complexity. I'd suggest that plug-in hybrids are the most complex vehicles on the road because you've got all of the complexity of a combustion vehicle and you've got all of the complexity of an electric vehicle. Anybody who thinks electric vehicles are simpler than combustion vehicles is a dickhead, because they're just complex in a different way. Show me how 7,000 cells and 14,000 welded connections and inverters and all of this wiring and coolant plumbing and all of the things that go hand in hand to make electric cars work. Show me how that's not complex. It's just complex in a different way to the moving parts of a combustion car. But anyway, in a plug-in hybrid, you've got all of this complexity and all of that complexity, and the additional complexity in the middle, which is integrating this system and that system together so that they can function and talk together and operate seamlessly, so that the poor bunny driving the vehicle doesn't have to pull too many levers just to get the scenery to move in a reliable way, kind of thing. So I would not own, for this reason, a plug-in hybrid outside the warranty, because the repairs there could be spectacular. The cost of repairs could be spectacular. And the other thing is, there's no guarantee that any of the major car makers is particularly proficient at diagnosing or fixing problems with these complex systems. You can't presuppose that, like they've all had the training or something. That's what they say in their marketing. But when you look at when they made diesel engines much more complex, the car industry was shit at problem solving, diagnosis and fixing. Like, forget it, dude. They were shit at that, and it took forever to catch up, kind of thing. And cars have gotten very complex now, and that has increased their reliability. So what the car industry does is it relies on the increased reliability in the aggregate of most cars. And that means that people who have problems with their car become outliers. And instead of having, 5% of people have problems with their cars that were pretty easy to diagnose and solve in, let's say, 2000. Now what we might have is less than 1% of people having problems with their cars. So yay, reliability. But those 1% of problems have become really difficult to solve. And there's not a great deal of focus at dealership level about diagnosis anyway. So you really are playing a bit of a game of roulette with reliability, and you're hoping that your numbers don't come up anytime soon, because if they do, that is a complete pain in the ass, and it could be long-winded and very frustrating, and also soul-crushing if you're with a manufacturer that doesn't really value you as a customer and is quite happy for you to go under the bus over and over and over. So for these reasons, the diesel for me would be the winner every time. It's the Mazda CX-60 I would buy, and I wouldn't be too unhappy about being, $11,000 better off with really good economy and really good performance and none of the potential complexity problems into the future.